Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today we have museum owner and author H. Leonard's Rosa Parks Beyond the Bus, Life, Lessons, and Leadership. Great conversation with H. Just has a really amazing story about how she came to own a museum, how Rosa Parks came to spend so much time with her. It's a really interesting conversation. I'm not going to belabor the point. Let's just get H on here so you can hear it. Here we go. And here we are with H. Leonard's Beyond the Bus, Life, Lessons, and Leadership. It's about her friend Rosa Parks. And you are also the owner of the O Museum. H, thank you so much for coming on.
I'm honored, truly.
H, I want to admit something to you. When I first started looking you up, right before I read the book, I said, oh, the owner of your museum. This is obviously somebody who comes from money and just, this is the fun thing she did on the side with mommy and daddy's cash. And I started looking more into you. The story that you often tell about before you became owner of the O Museum, you were trying to sign up for the Marines, right?
Yes.
Please tell me, how did that go?
So it was very important to me. I come from the Midwest. Country comes after God. I felt it was my duty to sign up for the Marines. It was the first year women were allowed in. Indiana, if you don't know this, is a very, very conservative state. And the men at the recruitment office did not want women in the military. They couldn't say no to me, but they lost my paperwork 3 times. So then I went, God is telling me to come to our nation's capital to help our country. And when I got here, my first job was as a nanny for 7 kids. It was absolutely wonderful because it was through the children's eyes that I learned the city. But I didn't meet anyone that wanted to help anyone but themselves. And it was really troubling for me. And then I started getting these visions of what I needed to do. I tell people truly visions through God, and all I was his facilitator. But through art and conversation and the arts in plural, scientific discoveries, because scientists to me are the highest form of creativity. They see the huge, bigger picture. And through music, maybe people would remember who they were when they got here and start to do things a little different than after they drank the Kool-Aid that Washington tends to pour out to people. So that's really how it started. And I had no money, no business, but obviously no money if I was a nanny for 7 kids. I did not marry any rich men to make this happen. And as a single woman in business, it was impossible to get loans. So it was just when credit card cash advances came out. So if you start with nothing, it doesn't matter. You shouldn't have fear if you get these visions of what you want to do to help other people. And somehow I'm still here after 43 blessed years, which is extraordinary because we were closed down for 10 months during the pandemic and did not close down with a savings account. But again, through the grace of God and people that we have helped, they helped us when we needed help. So a community does exist. It's important to build and believe in, and not having fear. That's the biggest hurdle people have when they start thinking and just not doing.
And you clearly took a chance that definitely worked out because, like you said, 43 years. But I will admit that my anxiety went up a little bit when you said, took out a bunch of credit cards. Like that just...
48 of them.
Okay.
And at the time, in 1980, I think interest rates were around 23%. I think I had $100 in the bank account. But it didn't bother me because I saw this place finished. So I knew it was going to exist for a long time.
So kids out there, if you're listening, very specific circumstances, when you have a true belief in something, then you can open up a bunch of credit cards. Don't do it just for funsies. That's a bad idea.
Correct. It's got to have a mission. You've got to have a vision.
Now, you have the O Museum. Now, it didn't start off, like if people go to it today, it's much larger than it started, right? Because you just started in a smaller piece and then just kind of built it up over years, right?
Correct. It started with one row house that happened to have a side yard. So over the years, we built on the side yard. We purchased other houses through whole life insurance that I was fortunate to get in my 20s when it wasn't expensive. So there was different ways that we were able to create the place. It's now 110 rooms. 110 different ceilings, all of them different, because to get people to look up and understand that you're just a little piece of the universe, reach out and help other people. And that's really the purpose of the house, is remain consistent and constant through the years.
Now, a lot of people hear museum and they think, okay, it's a big, cavernous, cold place with a whole bunch of stuff that you're not allowed to touch. My understanding is the O Museum is basically the opposite of that. What's kind of the feeling? What do you want it to kind of stand for? What do you want people to know before they walk in?
That they can touch history. That's so important that they can feel history, that it comes alive, but it doesn't have to be in a cold, boring museum. We also have comfortable seating throughout the facility where people can relax and sit down and meet new friends, meet new people. When people go out to museums, no one ever talks to anyone. There's a guard in a room with his hands folded and pointing his finger, no, 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 don't touch. We're just the opposite. It's an experience, and it's really extraordinary. And I can be anonymous here and just listen to other people's stories, and it keeps me alive because other people, when you listen to other people's stories, there's so much to learn from them. We had a woman come in, and it was right after the earthquake in Washington. I don't know if any of you know about it, but all our chandeliers were moving. There's so many objects here. The Washington Monument was closed for, I think, 10 years. The National Cathedral was closed for, I think, 6 years from the damage from the earthquake. We had one plate break, and it was a Gone with the Wind plate. And my husband said, oh, let's just put it up on the table and put on it damaged at the earthquake of the year. And we thought it was funny. And some woman came up to us 2 weeks later and said, I want to purchase this plate. And I laughed and said, why? And she said, well, I'm an anthropologist, and it's just something I don't know why. And I asked her what she had done in her life, and she turned out to be from the age of 18 until Albert Schweitzer died, his assistant. And we sat for hours talking about all these stories. She had written a book about them. She sent me, it was out of print. I mean, I would never have known who she was if it wasn't for that broken plate.
And I remember that earthquake. I was in the DC area at the time. And we should probably mention that if you're in California right now listening to this, it's not an earthquake by your standards, but by DC standards, it was significant.
Rare.
And you did mention this. Stuff at the museum is for sale. It's not just there to just be looked at and get the heck out. If you see something you like, it's probably for sale.
Yes, and it's donated. And primarily, probably 98% of what's here is donated to us, which is also extraordinary. That's how people are helping us, by sending us memorabilia from their lives. And they want to be represented here. And I say it happens in threes. So if we get something from someone about the Beatles, 2 more people send it in. Or if we get a chandelier donated, 2 other people donate 2 more chandeliers. Or if we sell a carpet, mysteriously, we get carpet replacements from other donors. So it's just the sequence of what happens here is magical.
I mean, it's kind of the perfect example of paying it forward, right? That's just what it feels like.
Yes, and it works. And it's a very important concept.
Now, besides a museum, and this kind of leads us into the book, people also stay there, right? How does that work?
From the moment I moved in, initially I had no furniture because I had no money. I was sleeping on the floor. I had books, I had records, and I was sleeping on the floor. But immediately we started having people stay here. Some of them were homeless, and they also slept on the floor, but it was warm here in the cold winters. And they were primarily at that time vets. And one of them, by the name of Cordell, I heard him playing in a used clothing store I thought he was playing, but he was singing, and his voice sounded like the piano and his voice. He was extraordinary. So I ran up to the sales lady at the used clothing store and said, who was on the radio? I mean, the voice is incredible. And she said, oh, it's some homeless guy that's playing for clothes. So I went and talked to him, and we were having an event that night where everyone brought a dish because they had no money, and it was a costume party. And we didn't have tables. We all sat on the floor, and Cordell showed up, and he started to sing a cappella, and nobody talked the rest of the night. It was so extraordinary. And everybody gave what they could as a payment for him. And a few months later, he showed up at the door and said, I'm homeless. It's cold outside. Can I play at your house? And just before he came, someone had donated a Victorian piano, and he would sit every night with a little transistor radio, and he taught himself how to play the piano through the transistor radio. And it was extraordinary. And 5 years later, I got him a job for $2,500 a month at a club. But he didn't know how to take a shower. He couldn't keep his clothes clean. So he would come over. We would make sure that he was dressed appropriately, kept his clothes clean, and I would walk him to the club where he would perform. And we used to do on Christmas Eve, we were open all day and night, and we would serve about 1,000 people dinner, Christmas Eve dinner. And he would come every year, and he would sing. And one year he was singing "O Holy Night." And one of our guests, who I hadn't recognized until he opened his mouth, was Pavarotti. So Cordell got to sing "O Holy Night" with Pavarotti. Talk about magic.
Well, especially you just said you were sleeping on the floor when this started. You're buried in credit card debt. And then we jump ahead and, oh, here's Pavarotti. Just over in the corner, just hanging out, just seeing what's going on.
Yeah. But I think it's a blessing that I don't know who people are, because then you treat them like you should treat everybody. No one's ever any better than anyone else. And I think they appreciate that.
So you're making things work. Things are starting to really come together. And then Mrs. Parks comes into your life. So how did Rosa Parks first enter your life? And did you even see it coming at all?
No, I got a call from someone I didn't know who said he was calling from Detroit, and she had just been severely assaulted and didn't have any money, refused to ever go back to her home again where she had been assaulted, and needed a place to stay to heal her soul, her mind, and especially her body, because she was in very bad shape. The history story, if you Google it now, says that she went to the emergency room, she was released and went home. That's not what really happened. She was, even though her pacemaker was dislodged, and she was in fear of death, she was of the mind to make sure that everyone in the hospital signed an NDA that she was never there as a patient. She didn't want the children of the world to be afraid that, like she was when the Klan would rampage her home, her grandfather would sit with a gun in front of the door to protect them, that she didn't want them to go through that. So she was fine. Everything was great. And she came here to heal. No one knew she was staying here. It was about 6 months before she even left her room. She never left the house again without security. So she forgave, but she did not forget. And that's one of the important lessons she taught me. But I didn't know who she was for about 3 years. And that was a blessing also, because we bonded from the heart. We became close friends. And she trusted me because she knew I wasn't taking care of her because she was famous.
And speaking of famous, I like to go over this story because I think there's a lot of misconceptions around how Rosa Parks became, the Rosa Parks. I've heard other people tell it, and generally what they say is, oh, she was the lady on the bus. And then you ask questions, and a lot of times they'll say, well, she sat in the white section. And then recently, a lot of people also point out, oh, she was already doing a lot of protests and things like that, and this was just another plant and everything like that. Can you do me a favor and just get rid of some of these misconceptions? What happened that day?
And you will do Mrs. Parks a favor by asking that question, because it was one of the most frustrating things I watched her experience, where she got pigeonholed in a situation that wasn't reality. And what happened? She started working with rape victims in the South in the 1930s, which is 25 years before the bus situation. She did that to heal her spirit and mind because of the things that happened to Black women in the South. This was very important to give them a recognition of what happened to them and to document it for the NAACP. When she got on the bus, she was fumbling in her purse and she did not look up at the bus driver. And when she put the money in the machine, she looked up and was horrified who it was, because in the South, if you were a woman alone at the bus at night, the bus driver drove to the end of where it's the last stop, and there were the police, and the bus driver would rape Black women. So she was petrified when she saw him and was shaking. It was just after Emmett Till had happened, where she had seen his open casket, and she didn't get off the bus. She moved to the Black section of the bus. It was clearly marked white section in the front, Black section in the back. She sat in the Black section, and the bus driver recognized her and came back and started harassing her and asked her to move. And she said it was Emmett's picture that kept her anchored to the seat, and she was praying to God that she wouldn't move. It was the strength of that kept her seated there. And it was God's will that kept her seated there. So that's the real story. She was not in the white section. She would not have gotten on that bus. So you hear these stories that it was planned by the NAACP. They talked about it. It was not planned, but it was meant to happen because she was the perfect person. Because ever since she was small, she led an exemplary life. So there was nothing that she had ever done in her life that could be used against her. And she talked about that often, about how important it was that you be careful of the things you did so that you could be true to your vision and your mission. And many times she would talk to people that had lost their way. Many times they were politicians, and she would sit and try to redirect them. Sometimes it worked. Many times it did not work, which made her very sad. But it's life. At least she tried, is what she said.
Something else in her background that I found really interesting in your book is she was very clear about she wanted to be called Mrs. Parks, which, these days is kind of like, well, that seems weird, right? Why is it so formal? But there was a real strong reason for that. Why did she always want to be called Mrs. Parks?
In the South at the time, it was very difficult to get a marriage certificate. So many people would say they were married, but they truly weren't legally married. She loved her husband so much. She was so proud that they were legally married that she felt out of respect to him and to their relationship that she be called Mrs. at all times. And before she came to live with me, one of the things the gentleman that was on the phone that was an extraordinary man told me was, his name was Willis Edwards, don't ever call Mrs. Parks by her first name. And one time I slipped, and Mrs. Parks never got angry, never raised her voice, but the look on her face, I knew I had misstepped. And so I never called her by her first name again. And she loved her first name. It wasn't that she didn't. It was just really, she loved her husband also.
So you're friends with her for decades. What made you decide to write Beyond the Bus?
The Library of Congress did a one-woman show in 2019. It was the first time they'd ever done a major exhibit about one person. It had always been genres. And they came to me when they saw some of the pictures and letters from us and said, I should really write a book about her heart and soul because no one really knew her. And so I said, what a great idea. And I agreed to do that. And another thing is, if you say you're going to do something, move mountains to do it. So that was really the genesis. Up until that point, very few people even knew that she had lived with me for 10 years because I kept the privacy important. If you were lucky enough to have come through the museum when she was here, you knew she was here. And she did host gospel brunches here, but they were mostly her friends that came. So I wrote the book.
Did you have concerns when you started? Because I know, for instance, and you talk about this head on in the book, this is a Black woman's story, and no one can see because it's a podcast right now, but you are a white woman. Did you have concerns like that about telling this story or about making sure that you kept private what was supposed to be private forever?
I didn't have concerns about being white because Mrs. Parks didn't see color. I had concerns about telling some of the stories that she told me in privacy. And I talked to many people and many historians about my angst in doing that because it was so private. And then halfway through the book, I lost the book. It was not on my computer. It was not in cyberspace. And the way I deal with that happening is through the lessons Mrs. Parks taught me, which is don't be angry. There's a reason for everything. Go to sleep for as many days as you can to disappear and figure out why this happened. And when I came back from disappearing, which took me about a week, I realized that it was Mrs. Parks that made the book disappear because I wasn't writing the story that she wanted told, that I should write the things that she told me in private. Because if she had been alive after the Me Too movement started, she would have written her story. It wasn't talked about, wasn't allowed to be talked about in society before that. But she also, in one of her books, talks about her mother not being able to be a good mother. She talks about the pain that caused. She talks about her father leaving home when she was 2 and not being there for her. But she did it in a positive way because she really believed it was for a purpose. And she loved living with her grandparents. And when she was married, her mother came to live with her and she loved her mother. She understood, she had an empathy for her, but she told the story to get the children of the world to understand that it doesn't matter what you're born into. It doesn't matter all the bad things that happen to you. What matters is that it's your choice to who you want to become. And when you're serving other people, when you're helping other people less fortunate than you are, that's how you survive. Don't use an excuse that your parents weren't around when you grew up, not to be able to contribute to others.
She was very spiritual. Anybody can hear that. Even you yourself are very spiritual, talking about God, talking about visions, kind of plotting out that path for you. She was also very deeply religious, right?
Yes, and that's what we connected on. Our conversations were about God, family, love. I got to travel after I found out who she was. I became her traveling companion. So I got to listen to other people's stories about history and what her response was. But it was never part of our conversation. Our conversations were really about every day, who do you want to become? And also about the ability to forgive everyone, everything. And the next morning to forgive yourself. She kept on telling me over and over again, you have to forgive yourself, not just other people. So all the people that were unkind to her on many different levels, whether it's physical, emotional, she forgave. And then she forgave herself, because sometimes you think it's your fault and it's not. You have to forgive yourself. Things happen for a reason.
And it can be really easy to look at Mrs. Parks and just put her in the mold of Martin Luther King Jr. and just be nice to everybody all the time and everything like that. One of the revelations that you have in the book that I never knew was that she was involved with the Black Panther Party, which, to this day is still very controversial. Not going to get into that part of it. But it's easy to say she was very spiritual and kind of not realistic about things. But, she was involved with the Black Panther Party, which kind of shows that she looked at the world a little bit differently than maybe we would think she would.
Exactly. And she said many times that if it wasn't for Dr. King and his nonviolent movement, the Civil Rights Act would not have passed. So she understood it. She didn't necessarily believe it because she remembered as a child her grandfather sitting at the front door with a rifle to protect the family. She felt that was important. And she became a Black Panther when in 1968 there were the Detroit riots and her husband's barbershop was destroyed, not by the rioters, but by the police. The two of them went to a little diner that they serve your food in a brown bag and then you sit in the diner to eat it. They're not served at the table. And she wrote, and this is in the Library of Congress, the actual bag, "The struggle continues, the struggle continues." She wrote it over and over again on the bag because that's how she dealt with the pain that had happened and to figure out how she was going to go forward in her human rights movement and what needed to be done. And Malcolm X became her hero. But what's also interesting about the gentle, quiet Mrs. Parks that was a warrior inside was that she was, I believe, the only Black Panther that wasn't investigated by the FBI.
And that's pretty amazing. The irony of it, too, is that, she chose a path and she thought that there was a way to deal with this and didn't necessarily believe the nonviolent confrontation part of it. However, she became an American icon by being nonviolent and trying not to be confrontational. The day she got on that bus, she wasn't looking to do anything. She was just tired. She was upset. She did what she was asked to do. And this bus driver starts messing with her. And that's how she becomes an American icon. It's just a great irony. And it's amazing to think about nowadays.
Yes. And it's also a lesson to everyone that you can do things without money. It's about the action. It's not necessarily about the words. It's extraordinary how a whole movement started with a 90-pound, 5-foot frail woman refusing to stand up. And also that there were other politicians and people in the movement that other than Dr. King and Mrs. Parks, unfortunately, very few people know about. How did this woman become the icon she is? She deserved it because she was extraordinary and she was a true hero. But it's how do people become famous? I think it's because of her mantra, love is all that matters. I think it was because she couldn't have children herself because of her past, but she became the mother of all children in the world. Education was important. That's what she spoke about. She wrote letters to every student around the world that ever wrote to her. She wrote back. If you go to the Library of Congress, you can see she saved every single letter she ever got. She would document, because you're the historian, she would document what day she wore what dress and what shoes to what event. So before you know, perhaps, but here was this historian that documented all this.
And becoming an American icon, it can be very easy. We've seen it a lot nowadays where someone starts as something and they get behind the wrong cause or they get involved with the wrong person. Something that you pointed out is Mrs. Parks was very savvy too. She knew when people were just using her. And she would get her back up if she thought that were the case and just kind of get this person out of here, right?
Correct.
And is there anything really surprising that you thought about Mrs. Parks? What were just some of the things that you, either in the beginning or throughout your time with her, things that kind of popped out and you're like, wow, I just never would have expected this?
She taught me about seizing the moment. It was a lesson that I understood by the words, but not in reality. So when we went to meet the Pope in St. Louis together, I was excited that I get to meet the Pope. This is incredible. And I had 20 crosses that he could bless. I was thinking with my ego and not what could be seize the moment and what happened. So she asked me to write something for her that was short that she could handwrite before she met him and give her book Quiet Strength to him. And I wrote something on the plane with her, and it was very short. And there was one word in it that she didn't like, which was a great leader. And she said, "No, I don't like that. Everyone is great. Doesn't matter what you do or who you are, how old you are. Every human being is a great person." And then she didn't talk for about 3 or 4 minutes. And she said, he's a moral leader. And I went, how perfect is that? That really defines him. And after we finished that, I said how excited I was that we were going. And she said, and what I was going to have him bless the crosses. And she said, you have to understand God brought us to meet him for a purpose. The purpose is the two of us need to have a press conference the next day to talk about racism. Pope had never talked about racism and the cancer in our society until Mrs. Parks did. And after that, they did the press conference. But after that, you'll see in many of his speeches where he talks about racism, she had such an impact on him. And part of the reason she did was we were given directions not to walk up to the Pope, that he would come to us. And Mrs. Parks was in a wheelchair. And when she saw the big doors open up where he came out with his hat and his heavy robes, and he had a staff that he was carrying, he was in a lot of pain. So she asked me to help her up out of the wheelchair and walk to him. And he was taken aback, but so happy she had done that because he was in excruciating pain. And I think because of her simple gesture of just feeling his pain, he really opened up and listened and remembered. And by giving him a book, her story in it, and then her handwritten note, he spent time after. And they both together and alone made a significant impact on the world.
How often do you wake up and think, wow, my life is crazy? You just told a story about being in the same room with the Pope and Rosa Parks. That's how often does that hit you? And you're like, wow, this has been a crazy ride.
A man I talked about that introduced us, Willis Edwards, kept on telling me over and over again, you don't understand what's happening, H. You'll understand it 20 years from now. And that's about when I started to write the book. And I didn't understand it until I started writing the stories down, that it was wow. Every second with her was a wow. But when you're living it, you don't always understand that.
I mean, there's probably 3 other books of stories you just probably forgot because there are just so many. You can only remember so many, right?
Yes, you're exactly right.
So one of the reasons we founded History Nerds United is a lot of people say, I don't like nonfiction, I don't like history, I don't like reading it, right? If one of those people was in front of you and said, I'm not really into nonfiction, why should I read Beyond the Bus? What would you say?
This is about who somebody is with their heart, with their soul. This is about what it takes for you to become a leader. There are so many lessons in this book that will help you in your career and your life and your relationships with other people that are so important.
That's fantastic. H, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate your time.
I am truly honored. You are awesome.
Thanks. And that's it for this episode. H, thank you so much for coming on. Nerds, hit us up. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Listen to other episodes of the podcast. Leave us 5-star reviews. And Prime Day is coming up. We have a link on our website. We'll be putting it on social media. A couple extra clicks for you. Does not cost you anything, but gets us a great kickback from Amazon. Really appreciate you using that link. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.